Imagine two young people who live in your neighborhood. Let's call them Nina and David. They have both worked for the same company for many years. They know their responsibilities, their colleagues, the routines, and all the little habits that gradually turn a workplace into a familiar part of life. Nina usually drinks her first coffee at her desk. David often arrives a few minutes early and chats with the others before the working day begins. It is an ordinary workplace, but it has become an important anchor in their lives. Then, one Tuesday morning, Nina and David are invited to a meeting. The room is unusually crowded. Some people stare down at the table. Others study the manager's faces, trying to work out what is about to happen. A few minutes later, the message is clear. The department is going to be shut down. In 3 months, it will be gone. Nina and David are losing their jobs. At first, they both react in much the same way. They are stunned. They feel ignored and unfairly treated. They think about their bills, their families, their plans, and all the questions that no one in that meeting room can answer satisfactorily. They both have good reasons to be angry. They both have good reasons to be afraid. And on that day, neither of them has any idea what will happen next. 1 year later, the experience has still left its mark on both of them. But Nina and David are now in very different places. David often talks about the department closing. He describes how poorly the decision was prepared, how little appreciation the employees received, and how unfairly the company treated them. And much of what he says is true. David is not imagining the injustice. He is not exaggerating it. He really did lose something, even though he had always done his job reliably. And yet, part of him still seems to be sitting in that meeting room. Nina does not speak enthusiastically about what happened either. She also believed the decision was wrong. She also went through nights when she could barely sleep. She struggled with self-doubt. She had to reorganize her finances. And some employers did not even respond to her applications. Her story is not a simple success story in which a crisis somehow turns itself into a wonderful opportunity. But at some point, Nina began to ask herself a second question alongside the question of why. Not immediately, not on the first day, and not because she had suddenly become unusually optimistic. The second question was, what can I influence from where I am now? That question did not change what had happened. The department remained closed, her job remained lost, and the decision did not become any fairer. But the question slowly changed the way Nina looked at her own situation. And that is what this episode is about. It is not about claiming that we are responsible for everything that happens to us. We are not. It is about discovering some room to act again after a loss, a disappointment, or an injustice, without blaming yourself, without minimizing what happened, and without pretending that every problem can be solved by having the right attitude. When something distressing happens, our minds almost automatically begin searching for an explanation. Why did this happen? Who is responsible? Who made a mistake? Who could have prevented it? And sometimes, why did this have to happen to me? These questions are deeply human. They can also be extremely important. If we want to understand what happened, we need to ask about its causes. If we want to prevent a mistake from happening again, we need to understand how it occurred. And when boundaries have been violated, duties have been neglected, or people have been harmed, the question of who was at fault may also be necessary. The problem does not begin with the question, who was to blame? The problem begins when that becomes the only question. Every question directs our attention in a particular direction. Imagine a spotlight in a dark room. The spotlight can illuminate only one part of the room at a time. Everything within its beam becomes clearly visible. Other parts of the room remain in darkness. If you keep asking who was to blame, you will find more and more evidence of mistakes, failures, and injustice. If you keep asking why this had to happen to you, you will find more and more reasons why your situation is particularly difficult. That does not mean those reasons are wrong, but while your attention keeps returning to what happened, other questions can disappear from view. What do I need right now? What information am I missing? Who could support me? What can I protect? And is there one small step I could take that would make my situation a little clearer tomorrow than it is today? These questions do not replace the search for causes. They add something to it. You might say that the question of blame helps us make sense of the past. The question of influence helps us begin moving towards the future again. Both questions are allowed to exist side by side. Now, the question, "What can I do?" can also sound uncomfortable, especially when someone has only just been hurt, abandoned, disappointed, or shaken. Sometimes this question is asked before there has even been enough space to acknowledge what happened. Then it does not sound supportive. It sounds more like an accusation. Pull yourself together, look ahead, make something out of the situation. Other people have managed it too. That is not the kind of responsibility we are talking about here. After a loss, you are not automatically ready to make sensible plans. When someone has just received bad news, their thoughts often move between fear, anger, and a sense of emptiness. The body is tense. Their perspective narrows. Even small decisions can suddenly feel exhausting. At a moment like that, the next responsible step may be to avoid making any major decision at all. Perhaps you need a conversation. Perhaps you need sleep. Perhaps you need distance or distraction. Perhaps you need a doctor, a counselor, a lawyer, or simply someone who will listen. Sometimes the first step is nothing more than honestly naming what is there. I am disappointed. I am afraid. I feel humiliated. Right now, I do not know what to do next. Sentences like these do not solve the problem, but they give shape to a confusing emotional state. A feeling that once filled the entire room becomes something that can be observed and described. That is not yet a solution, but it is often the beginning of orientation. Responsibility does not mean forcing yourself to pull yourself together as quickly as possible. It can also mean taking your own condition seriously and creating the stability you will need to make decisions later. First, stabilize. Then, sort things out. And eventually, take action. That order is not a sign of weakness. It is often the most sensible approach. In conversations, several different ideas are often mixed together. First, there is the cause. A cause describes what led to something happening. A department is closed because a company wants or needs to cut costs. A relationship breaks down because trust has been lost. A financial problem develops because income has fallen or spending has remained too high for too long. Understanding a cause helps us see how different events are connected. Then there is the question of fault. Fault goes one step further. It asks not only what happened, but whether someone neglected a duty, crossed a boundary, or deliberately caused harm. In some situations, this distinction is crucial. Someone who breaks a contract may be responsible for the consequences. Someone who uses violence cannot excuse their actions by claiming that both sides played some part in the conflict. And someone who abuses their power should not be relieved of responsibility through a vague demand that the victim should simply let go. Someone really can be at fault. And sometimes that needs to be stated clearly. Then there is the accusation. That is something different again. An accusation may begin with a justified statement. You lied to me. You broke an agreement. You abandoned me when I was going through a difficult time. But while the question of fault tries to make sense of what happened, an accusation can turn into an inner loop. The same conversation is repeated over and over again, sometimes with the other person, sometimes only inside your own mind. You should have acted differently. You should have seen it coming. You should have apologized. And perhaps every one of those statements is true, but repeating them endlessly does not necessarily change anything. It ties your attention to a moment that has already passed. Responsibility shifts our attention to a different level. It does not begin by asking who caused the damage. It asks what can now be protected, clarified, or changed. What boundary do I need? What support am I missing? What decision needs to be made? Which consequences can I limit? And, despite everything, what can I still influence? Responsibility, then, is not a substitute for fault or blame, nor does it excuse the person who caused the harm. It is the question of how your own life can continue while the truth of the past remains unchanged. This is where one of the greatest misunderstandings arises. Many people hear the word responsibility and immediately think, then I suppose it must be my own fault. But those are not the same thing. You can be responsible for your next step without having been responsible for the situation that made the step necessary. A child is not responsible for the behavior of their parents. A person who has been betrayed is not responsible for the betrayal. Someone who has experienced violence is not responsible for another person choosing to use violence. Someone who loses their job because of a business decision did not cause that decision simply by being one of the people affected by it. And someone who becomes ill is not automatically to blame for their illness. There are many things in life that we did not choose. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that we neither caused nor deserved. But eventually, a new question emerges. What do I need now so that what happened does not take up even more space in my life than it already does? Perhaps the answer is distance. Perhaps it is legal advice. Perhaps therapy. Perhaps a financial plan. Perhaps medical treatment. Perhaps a conversation with someone you trust. And sometimes the part you can influence is very small. Perhaps at this moment you cannot change 99% of your situation, but 1% is still in your hands. Responsibility does not mean pretending that the 1% is actually 100%. It simply means noticing the 1% that is still yours. You might also compare fault and responsibility to two different objects. Blame can feel like a heavy stone being placed on your back. You should have prevented this. You failed. You are the problem. Responsibility is different. It is more like a small steering wheel. It does not remove the weight, but it allows you to make a small change of direction, perhaps only for the next few feet. So you are allowed to say, I did not cause this. It was not right. I did not deserve it. And I am still going to take care of what I need now. These statements do not contradict one another. In difficult situations, everything in our minds often becomes mixed together. Another person's decision, our own reaction, the past, the possible future, the fear, and eventually the entire situation feels uncontrollable. A distinction that sounds very simple at first can help us sort things out. There are things we cannot control. The past is one of them. We cannot change what has already been said, done, or decided. We also cannot control what other people think, whether they recognize what they have done, whether they apologize, whether they change their behavior, whether they understand our point of view. Economic developments, chance events, illnesses, and political decisions are also often far beyond our direct control. Then there are things we can influence without being able to determine the final outcome. We can prepare carefully for a conversation. We can explain our perspective. We can apply for a job. We can negotiate. We can try to improve a relationship. But whether the other person listens, whether we get the job, or whether the negotiation succeeds is not entirely in our hands. And finally, there are things we can decide for ourselves. Whether we begin a conversation, whether we gather information, whether we make an appointment, whether we set a boundary, whether we send an application, whether we ask someone for help, whether we take a break, or whether we consciously decide not to make a decision yet. These three areas are not always completely separate, but even sorting them approximately can bring relief, because we often make one of two mistakes. Either we try to control something that lies beyond our control. Then we spend enormous amounts of energy trying to change other people, either in reality or inside our own minds. Or we declare the entire situation uncontrollable and overlook the small areas in which we could still do something. The goal is not to take on as much responsibility as possible. The goal is to take responsibility in the right place, not where we have no influence, but where a genuine decision is still possible. On the evening after the announcement, Nina is sitting in her kitchen. The company's letter is lying in front of her. Beside it are several bills and a notepad that she normally uses for shopping lists. Her coffee has gone cold. Tina opens her laptop and searches for job vacancies. The first job posting requires a qualification she does not have. The second would involve a much longer commute. The third sounds interesting, but Nina believes she is missing several years of experience in a particular area. She closes the laptop again. Within just a few minutes, her mind has turned the fact that her department is closing into an entire story about the future. I will not find a suitable job. Other applicants are better qualified. Everything will become more difficult financially. Perhaps I should have changed jobs years ago. Perhaps I have already missed my chance. This process is typical. Our minds do not stop at the information we have received. They immediately try to turn it into a story about the future. That is understandable. The brain wants to recognize danger as early as possible. It wants to be prepared. But under stress, it sometimes treats fears as though they were already facts. Eventually, Nina picks up the notepad. On the left-hand side, she writes down what she knows for certain. The department is closing. Her job will end in 3 months. She does not yet have a new job. She lacks some of the knowledge required for certain positions. On the right-hand side, she writes down the story her mind is creating from those facts. No one will employ me. I am too old. My professional future is over. Everything will get worse. When Nina looks at both sides, her fear does not disappear, but she notices a difference. The left-hand side contains facts. The right-hand side contains interpretations and predictions. Some of those predictions may come true, others may not. And between the two sides, something begins to appear that was barely there before. A small amount of inner distance. Nina does not have to argue with her fear. She does not have to convince herself that everything will definitely work out. For now, it is enough to recognize, I do not yet know how this will end. That sentence may not sound particularly impressive, but between everything will fail and I do not yet know how this will end, there is already a small amount of freedom. Nina could now continue reading job postings late into the night. From the outside, that would look very active, but on this particular evening, it probably would not be especially helpful. She is exhausted. Her body is tense. Her thoughts are jumping from one fear to another. Every unsuitable job posting feels like further proof that her situation is hopeless. Severe stress changes the way we perceive the world. We notice risks more quickly than opportunities. We grasp at the first available solution, or we avoid making any decision at all. We interpret uncertainty as danger, and we tend to draw far-reaching conclusions from very little information. That is why responsible action can initially look surprisingly unspectacular. Nina places both feet firmly on the floor. She slowly breathes out several times. She drinks a glass of water. Then she calls a friend. At the beginning of the conversation, she says, I do not need a solution tonight. I just need to say it out loud. Her friend listens. She does not immediately try to turn the job loss into an opportunity. She does not tell Nina that she is certain to find something better. Nor does she remind her that other people have bigger problems. She simply listens. When the conversation ends, the problem is still there. But Nina's inner tension has eased slightly. She decides not to write any applications that evening. Instead, she writes down 3 questions that she wants to clarify the following day. How long will I continue to receive my salary? Is the company offering any support? And what qualifications are employers in my field actually looking for right now? Then she closes the laptop. That, too, is responsibility. Not because Nina already has a solution, but because she has recognized that taking action and doing something helpful are not always the same thing. Sometimes, taking a break is not an attempt to escape the problem. Quant creates the conditions we need to deal with the problem sensibly. The next morning, Nina picks up her notepad again. She tries to sort out her situation by asking 3 questions. The first question is, what has actually happened? This question sounds simple, but answering it is more difficult than it first appears. A calm and factual answer might be, my department is being closed. My employment will end in 3 months. I do not yet have a new job. Not, my career is over. Not, no one needs me anymore. And not, I am going to fail financially. These thoughts are understandable, but they do not describe what has already happened. They describe one possible future. The second question is, what can I not change right now? Nina cannot reverse the company's decision. She cannot determine which jobs are currently available. She cannot force an employer to invite her to an interview, and she cannot know how long her search will take. These things matter, but they are not entirely in her hands. The third question is, what could be one small and helpful next step? Not the entire plan, not the solution for the next 10 years, just one step that would make the situation a little clearer. At first, Nina thinks she needs to begin writing applications immediately, but what she actually lacks is information, so she decides to call a former colleague who moved into a different industry 2 years earlier. She wants to know which skills are genuinely in demand there and whether her previous experience would be transferable. The conversation lasts less than 15 minutes. Afterwards, Nina still does not have a new job, but she knows more than she did before. And sometimes that is exactly the purpose of a first step. It does not have to solve the problem. It only has to improve the starting point for the step that follows. Many people do think about what they could do when they are in a difficult situation, but their answer remains so large that it is almost impossible to act on. I need to find a new job. I need to save my relationship. I need to get my finances under control. I need to change my life. Statements like these describe a goal, but they do not yet describe a specific action. A genuine next step is smaller. It usually begins with a verb: call, open, write down, ask, arrange, cancel, compare, send. And it is specific enough that afterwards you can tell whether it actually happened. For Nina, the next step is not build a new professional future. It is call my former colleague and ask one question. During the conversation, Nina learns that several job postings mention an additional qualification. But in practice, employers are mainly looking for knowledge in one particular area. So Nina searches for an introductory course. The next step is no longer start again. It is compare 3 courses. After that, register for 1 course. Later, update her resume. And eventually, send an application. Movement often begins not with one enormous decision, but with a sequence of small ones. Each individual decision may seem almost insignificant, but together they change the direction of travel. You may recognize this from other areas of life. I need to have that difficult conversation may feel too large. I will begin by writing down 3 sentences I want to say is smaller. I need to organize my entire financial situation can feel paralyzing. Today I will open all the unopened letters and place them on the table is more manageable. I need to change my whole life gives you almost no idea where to begin. I will take 15 minutes and write down what is troubling me most right now is more specific. A small step does not always look impressive, but it is often more effective than a grand intention that is never begun. At this point, an inner resistance sometimes appears. If I focus on my next step now, does that mean the person who caused the harm simply gets away with it? That concern is understandable. Looking ahead must never mean remaining silent about injustice. It may be necessary to object. Filing a complaint may be the right thing to do. Taking legal action can be an expression of responsibility. A clear confrontation or asking for an apology may also be appropriate. But seeking justice and continuing to live are two different tasks. You can try to clarify what happened while also reorganizing your daily life. You can pursue a claim and still develop new plans. You can wait for a decision while continuing to care for your relationships, work, learn, or recover. The difficulty begins when your entire inner life depends on another person acknowledging that you were right. At the beginning, David was still sitting in that meeting room in his mind. Now, Nina is helping him make sense of his situation. She does not solve the problem for him. David takes the next step himself. Perhaps the same is true for you. You do not need to know what the entire path will look like. Recognize what you can influence today and begin there. Responsibility is not blame. It is the opportunity to give your life direction again. And perhaps this is the one thought worth taking away from this episode. Responsibility does not begin where you can control everything. It begins wherever your next action can make a real difference. Good decisions change your life, one step at a time. Give us a like if you enjoyed this content and would like to support Navigol, and subscribe to the channel to learn how to think more clearly, make more conscious decisions, and follow your own path.